This is CRM Audio Performance Edition with Stephen Smith and Joel Lindstrom. This episode is brought to you by KingswaySoft. KingswaySoft is a leading integration solution provider offering software solutions that make data integration affordable and painlessly easy. Thousands of enterprise clients from over 80 countries and regions rely on KingswaySoft to integrate data with various business systems in order to drive their business efficiency and fully leverage their information assets. And by the way, KingswaySoft is a great choice to replace some of your asynchronous operations that might be eating your Dynamics performance. We thank KingswaySoft for sponsoring CRM Audio Performance Edition.
And we're back on CRM Audio with Stephen Smith. How you doing, Stephen?
Pretty good.
Got good feedback from the performance episode we did a few weeks ago, so I thought, let's do it again.
Yes, sounds good.
So let's talk about a debate that I've heard in the community about workflows.
Yes.
You got your real-time synchronous workflows. You got your background process asynchronous workflows. By default, it goes to background process.
Background,
right?
yes. Yep.
So, what are your thoughts? Are you gung-ho? You should always use background processes. You should always use real time.
Well, I think it's actually a little unfortunate that it says recommended next to background workflows, because while that may be something that is probably more useful, I think there's a situation where you can get to people will just create everything as async. And the thing that you want to be considerate of is what is the impact that it's actually having on the system to have an async workflow as opposed to a synchronous one. And, you know, what you could do if you profile actually the performance of the system, you'll find that, for example, if you have a system where everything is async, you'll have what I like to call a hot back end where all the async servers are churning away at 100% because they're trying to process so many activities that have been generating in the system. And then, you know, the front ends are going to sit there and mainly focus on the UI stuff with the user. But I think there's something to be said about balance, right? So if, for example, you're doing something with a record where you're not actually doing anything fancy or querying other records in the system, it's not heavy, the question has to be asked, well, why should that be async as opposed to synchronous? And I think that synchronous makes sense up to a point where maybe it does start to be noticeable to the user, but if you can get away with stuff synchronously, I think in the terms of balancing the performance of the system, to use synchronous is actually good. And I don't think everything should be async, especially if you have a lot of users and your async servers are hot, basically.
That's okay. You just slap on a few more async servers, right?
Yeah, well, yeah. So in, you know, your traditional Dynamics deployments, it's recommended that you not have more than 4. And part of the problem is that Dynamics is actually using a table as a queue, which actually is an anti-pattern. But anyway, those async servers are competing with each other. So what ends up happening is you could end up with deadlocks in your database, and then your jobs actually aren't executing.
So the kind of devil's advocate, what I've heard people who are proponents of mainly using asynchronous processes is that there's a corresponding performance impact from too much real-time processes, meaning it will, in some cases, you get too many real-time processes. It could take a minute for the form to close, or you have, or a record to save, or you've got,
right.
You hit the limit where the real-time process times out.
Yeah, and that gets back to where it depends, right? If you're doing something that will definitely impact performance from a user's perspective, obviously the async route is probably the better route to go. The thing to consider when it comes to async as well is there's actually an overhead. It's like putting something on your credit card as opposed to spending cash right up front. There is an overhead if you consider, especially in high load situations where all of the front ends now have to write records to this async operations table for them to then be executed at a later point in time. That, in addition to the async servers constantly polling the table as that table grows in size, it just increases the load throughout the system, especially on the database, which if you're in this high load situation, you're just kind of exacerbating the load that's already being put on the database.
Yeah, I think the thing that I see too is there's so much relying on the async pipeline.
Yeah.
Besides workflows, be it duplicate detection, be it business process flows load asynchronously. I don't know if they're using the asynchronous process though, but you've got to turn off your async process and see what doesn't happen. Users can't even log into the system without it, and emails don't track, and all kinds of stuff happens if you get your async. If you get asynchronous constipation.
Yeah. So, I mean, the way I kind of look at it from an architectural perspective is I try to do everything that I can to, A, balance the load of the system, but also, B, I like to try to do everything I can to keep that async operations table kind of at a nominal level and not have it, like, explode, especially if you have, like I said, a lot of users that are doing things and kicking off a bunch of asynchronous processes. It can definitely cause some challenges with your async services. So there's a couple ways that you can actually offload some of your async processing, which is obviously is good for system performance, and let Dynamics kind of focus on its core async operations kind of flows.
Right. So I think one of the most exciting ways to do it is Microsoft Flow.
Yes.
And Flow has come a long way. When it first came out, we kind of viewed it as maybe a toy, but it's much better than it used to be. And a couple key things have happened. One is it's now pretty much at parity with workflow. So if you need to do something in an asynchronous workflow, you can do it in a flow now. And there's more you can do because it'll, for example, Jerry Weinstock wrote a post yesterday about how you can query for related records and update each of them. So the scenario we used to do a workflow assembly. How many people had the old Codeplex distribute workflow assembly? That would basically, when the address on the account changes, go through and change all the contacts. And it can also do some other things. But the biggest plus to Flow that I see is, now we have the capability to include it in dynamic solutions. Yes. The flow definition is stored in the database just like a process, like a workflow. But it is executed outside of the dynamic scale group. So by design, it doesn't have the performance degradation that a workflow does. Now, if you're doing a lot of reads and writes, you still might see some, but it's not going to be the same level as the asynchronous service getting backlogged.
Right, and the interesting thing about that in the scale group that you're running your tenant in, for CRM Online anyway, you're actually still sharing the async servers with your scale group buddies, so to speak. So you may have a noisy neighbor that's actually bringing down your performance of your async processes as well. So by using Flow, you kind of get around that, and that's, I think, is a great thing.
Right, and we know from the roadmap that Microsoft's intention is to someday replace workflow with Flow. And so my thought is, now that that's out there and we're at parity, I'm doing a disservice to my clients if I just keep piling on additional asynchronous workflows. Right. Because while it's still supported and works and probably will for the next couple of years, I'm creating a burden for when it does get replaced. Where I want to be where the train is going, not where it is today. Right. And that fact that Flow can do that, and can do a lot more. I'll give you some other simple examples. If I have a send email step with a Flow, I see the email in my sent items. If it comes from me, and I don't if a workflow sends it. And you might ask, well, what about security? We have now with the CDS connector, you have this thing scope. So I can create an organization scope flow like I would with a workflow, that I don't have to grant any permissions to individual users or share that flow with them. I can just create an organization scope flow and have that just like a workflow.
And that's a beautiful thing, because one of my challenges earlier on with Flow was just the governance aspect of it.
Right.
So now that you can control the scope, I think it makes a lot of sense to start using that as an avenue for your async processing.
Right. So again, I think there's still a place for workflow, and if you have legacy workflows, I don't think you have to go rip them all out.
No.
But the good news is, we have other choices. The other thing that I find just very intuitive about Flow is testing it, because if you test a flow and something goes wrong, you can see very easily where it went wrong, fix it, but then you can say, try again with the last execution.
Nice.
So you don't have to go back in, trigger the trigger record. How many times with workflow have you written a workflow, it didn't exactly work, so you had to go in, deactivate it, change it,
Yep.
publish it,
Yep.
go back, trigger it again, and you do that 5 or 6 times, get 10 test records created.
Yeah.
It's really messy. This is much cleaner.
So does that actually work in a production scenario where maybe a workflow for a user failed and you went back and maybe fixed something or whatever? Can you rerun that workflow?
Yeah, absolutely. So
Nice.
I've got some personal flows that I do that generally I don't see failures because the system is unreliable. It's very reliable, but sometimes, like I've got one that when I get an email with an attachment, it will move it to OneDrive, so I have a history of my attachments.
Yeah.
And every now and then I get an attachment with a character in the title that isn't
Right.
supported,
Yep.
so that one fails, and I can go in and I can adjust my flow and rerun it with that call.
Nice.
So yeah, it's really good. On the async versus synchronous workflow topic, the one thing I like about designing a workflow as a background process is the error messages are more meaningful than the real time.
Right.
So, but what I found is sometimes I will design it as a background process, test it out, make sure it works,
Right.
then change it to real time and see what the performance is.
Yeah.
Usually if it's like 1 or 2 steps in there, it works. If it's updating a bunch of related records or something, or if it's sending emails or something like that takes a little bit longer, then it may not work. But that gives you the ability to test it, get the
Yes.
more meaningful error messages, go in and convert it to real time, and then test it out.
And I think, getting back to your rationale for why something should be synchronous versus async, one of the things is if the user expects to see something immediately, obviously that makes sense for synchronous processing. But my general rule of thumb is if I'm not doing something that's complex or a long-running process, and let's say, for example, I'm updating like the name field on a particular record, which typically ends up being some kind of concatenation of other fields on that record or something of that nature, then go ahead and make it synchronous. It doesn't need to be async, but having this flow option definitely changes the game a little bit, since now that you can run that out of process from Dynamics, it's not creating that additional load on your back end.
Yeah, absolutely. So if somebody hears you say this and thinks, "Oh, Stephen's saying always use real-time processes," is that what you're saying?
No, definitely not. No, I mean, like I said, everything, especially in the consulting world, it depends on the scenario. There's a lot of things that are called a best practice that really are best practices under certain scenarios. They're not globally universal best practices. So, but I think in general, with that recommended label on the workflow designer, I think that was a mistake. I don't think that should have been there, but it is. And making everything async is going to have an impact on the system, minus the flow equation. But that's always been my concern, is just making sure that I don't run my async servers hot,
Right.
with everything in the system being an async process.
Well, I know from experience now that we work together, we've both seen an environment where every single workflow in the environment is asynchronous and every
Right.
single plugin is synchronous.
Yeah, that was weird.
And it just shows there wasn't any thought behind that. They just went with the default.
And I don't think most developers actually think about whether it makes sense for something to be synchronous or not. I think a lot of people, for example, with the recommended label on the workflow engine, just leave it as it is.
Right.
And I think what we have to do nowadays, especially with the growth of the platform, especially with Power Apps coming on and all these other things that are going to be connecting to Dynamics, we have to be more cognizant of how we design things and the reasons why we choose one option over another. Because as we get to these like larger enterprise class deployments, those choices are going to have real consequences that we wouldn't have to worry about if we're dealing with, like, say, a 50 or 100 user deployment.
Right. I think both real-time and asynchronous processes can have performance issues.
Right.
The thing I find is real-time processes, if there's going to be a performance issue with it, it's pretty readily available. Like, this is too complex an operation. Whereas a background process sneaks up on you.
Yes. Yeah.
When you're developing it, nobody's using the system, or you have 50 users with 500 records, it works great. But then you scale up to 5,000 users and 5 million records, you get backlog and you get things running very slowly.
Then you also have to consider the behavior of your users, right? So if you have 1,000 users importing 5,000 records, and you have, for example, a bunch of different async processes that are kicking off on that particular entity, the consequence can be that your async operations table is just going to grow out of control, and that's where your async service can actually go down because it just can't manage the load that it's put on it all of a sudden.
Do you ever have the impatient user that runs the workflow and doesn't think it ran and hits it 5 more times?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I actually know someone that did that, except they imported a million rows 4 times. And the async service for that scale group went down.
Wow.
And I think I mentioned that last time. But anyway, I got a phone call from the Dynamics Online support team, and they asked me, what are you doing over there? Because you brought down the whole async server for the tenant. So they had to go through and actually bulk remove all those async operations that were kicked off by this one particular user. So especially when, like I said, when you're in these enterprise class situations, you have to also consider what users may do, and you can't always predict what their behavior might be.
Right. So that's great. So use common sense, I think, is the answer.
Yes, common sense and just sticking to what the scenario is and figuring out what is the best choice, but also what's possibly going to be a performance issue later. Flow is obviously a great part of a solution, and it's like I'm just happy that it's grown to the point where it's at, and it's a separate execution pipeline for a dynamic system. The other way you could do that is with the more developer route is with Azure Service Bus and functions.
Right.
And I think that makes a lot of sense when you have a scenario that doesn't fit Flow.
Right.
The developers can come in and kind of really create some intricate design patterns to not only perform work inside Dynamics, but also when you're integrating with other systems that maybe there's not a Flow connector for that.
Yeah, you need a custom connector. You need a little bit more control over that. But the nice thing is you have a path to start with Flow, model it out, test it, and if it grows there, you can convert it. You don't have to start over.
Right. I would definitely start with whatever you can possibly do with Flow, and then for those scenarios that kind of escape the Flow realm of operations, you can definitely go with that service bus and functions route.
Right, and that's where I think, kind of the opposite to this of the people who might say you should always use background processes. You do have developers who say you should always use logic apps and functions, which can be overkill. And I think there's a case to be made for a process, be it a workflow or a flow, that can be edited and changed by somebody who's not a developer.
Yes,
Because
I definitely like that.
I'm modeling one out right now to do a contact scoring thing. They want to see like how complete their contact data is. So when a contact is created or updated, score it based on like 5 points of it as an email address, 2 points of its job title, all that stuff. And Flow has variables that can increment and do that, calculate that score. And so you might say, well, we'll just do a plugin or do a function to do this, but we know that score is going to change over time.
Right,
It'll add a new field or change the weighting on the job title field or whatever. And I want to give it, not so everybody there can do it, but an admin who's not a developer can go in and tweak that without having to either call me or be a developer to change it. But then there's definitely the case where the requirements get more complex, and that's where I love there's still the developer options.
And I like the pattern of trying to make the functionality configurable by a non-developer, because that just helps the system be more maintainable, right? If you have to have a developer every time something changes, it kind of creates a reliance that the business itself doesn't really want. But if you look at the Microsoft strategy moving forward, this democratization of IT, that's where they're going. That's why Power Apps exist. That's why Flow makes sense, and then even Power BI. All this stuff is kind of moving away from the developer to where a power user or an admin can be able to change this stuff without having to call in developers. So that's a great way to go.
Right. Well, this is good. This is a great topic, and this is where performance hits people, whether they're online or on premises. Everybody wants to automate everything, but nobody wants to have a slow customer engagement system.
No, you can create the perfect system that fulfills all the requirements, but if it doesn't perform, no one really cares.
So the worst workflow I ever created, this was after I'd been doing this for like a year and a half, and I got this scenario that was basically doing a big counter scenario for a magazine merchandiser who would go to the store and wanted to maintain a count of how many copies of Cosmopolitan there were on the shelf.
Okay.
It got up to like 70 steps. And what I learned from that experience is, A, that was a terrible thing to do with the workflow. But B, when you add a step to the workflow designer, it gets progressively slower.
Yes.
I don't know if you notice this. So if you don't usually see it for the first or second or third or 10th or 15th one, but if you get up above like 16 to 20 steps, each step you add, you're going to wait to add that, and each one after that gets progressively slower. But by the time I got to step 50, it was like hit the button, wait for a minute, then it would pop up, and then the whole thing, I think, imploded on itself.
Yeah, I've never been a fan of the workflow designer in Dynamics just because of that kind of quirky kind of behavior as you're creating the steps. That's always been something that irritated me, but I've gotten used to it over time. But
I think in some ways the capabilities were ahead of its time and pretty revolutionary, but it's like they stopped with the designer in 2010.
Yeah, this
is good enough.
Yeah, right. Yeah, they've never enhanced it. They didn't So, and
that's why, just like for a CRM person approaching Power Apps, for somebody who's used to using workflows, going to Flow, it's a little bit confusing because the things aren't called exactly the same thing and the way you do things. But then once you figure out how to do things, it's so much more logical, and it's so much more forgiving if you want to say move a step or add something between two steps. You can see it visually, and so that's where I find it's easier to train somebody on how to create a flow than how to create a workflow. Just those of us who've been doing workflow for a decade or longer, we're so used to it and set in our ways that it makes sense to us, but you're putting in a new user hat, it's pretty confusing.
It is.
Because you got to make sure I love the ones like when you have the check conditions and a check condition inside of a check condition, you got to make sure you're clicking exactly the right line.
Yes, and then you mess up and you put it on the wrong line.
Yeah.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, exactly.
I've never really, like I said, I've never really loved it. But maybe the reason they never bothered to update it is because they saw in their crystal ball that Flow was coming. So,
and my favorite rookie workflow mistake that everybody makes is when they design a real-time workflow the first time and they end with a status of canceled, meaning stop the workflow, and instead it rolls back the whole transaction.
Yeah, that's nice.
Have you seen that before?
No. I've never seen that before. One thing in particular, since we're talking about workflow, that a little slight pet peeve of mine is the wait condition. I always love the wait condition because,
And just to say, I had a week-long tip-of-the-day debate with George Dubinsky.
Oh, really? Okay,
we came to kind of a détente about it.
Okay. Well, I mean, my challenge for the wait condition is the fact that when you create these workflows,
mm-hmm.
they will sit in the async operations table waiting for that condition. I actually had one project where the developers had created a wait condition where it waited a year for it to fire again. And the problem was there was 500,000 records that this applied to. And so, you automatically have an async operations table with a 500,000 bloat on top of.
And then you change the definition of what the workflow should do. It doesn't update existing waiting conditions.
Right. So in that case, that was an absolute horrible way to kind of go about fulfilling the requirement. What we ended up doing instead of that was to have an outside process that would check for that condition. This actually wait workflow would recreate an opportunity. Okay. So basically, the way the system worked, that there was a copy of an opportunity that it would make for the next year, and then the users would be able to work with that copy. But the problem, of course, was just having it sit there in the async operations table wasn't very performant.
Right.
And creating this outside process that would just check for that condition and then create the opportunities was a much better way to go.
Right, and that's where I think, if I remember right, I'll put the link to the post we had about wait conditions, because my argument was always kind of like you're saying, it's bad for performance. I've seen an environment with very few wait conditions just basically bring the environment down almost.
Yeah,
and part of it is design patterns. The timeout is definitely better than a wait until execution time, for example. Wait until execution time will kill your environment. But even the timeout does have some overhead because it's got to check for that timeout condition. The other thing that is recommended is going to separate your execution logic from your wait logic, so that when the wait condition, when the timeout's done, it's not the definition of what happens isn't in that workflow, but it's calling then a child workflow. I've seen other people get over the long wait condition by having kind of looping shorter waits.
Right.
So those are all things you can do, but that's where, again, today, in my opinion, there's very little reason to use a wait condition when you can have Flow do that for you and can do it outside the asynchronous out of the asynchronous pipeline.
No, I think that completely makes sense. And since we have Flow, you don't have those records sitting in your async operations table. Definitely gets a thumbs up for me from a design perspective.
Right, but I'm also a fan too. If it's the year-long wait condition, I would rather have some trigger that with a KingswaySoft job or something.
Right.
You want to have something that sends a birthday email to somebody once a year.
Yes.
Don't have a wait condition for everybody in your database.
Exactly.
Have a SSIS job that runs that finds everybody whose birthday is this week and triggers something to send them a birthday card.
And I think just the reason you see these kinds of design patterns where you have the wait conditions is just because it's easy to do, right? If it's easy, depending on who the developer is, if they can meet the requirement, they're just going to go the easier route. But when you do the easy thing, sometimes it'll catch you later on.
Right. All right. Well, this has been good. We covered a lot of ground here, and again, I think you're dead on that you shouldn't just go with the default, that you should consider the performance impact and how real time it needs to be. Consider the user experience, how impatient users are. Go with the flow for the background processes. You'll be good.
Yes.